Hey everyone, Dr. Steve here. You know it as well as I do, but most students need a B or better in A&P. But did you know that students are doing that all over the US using my Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite as a low-cost alternative to expensive textbooks? Digital Suite delivers the key concepts of A&P with short, assignable tutor videos and a bulleted narrative study guide that not only explain the concepts of A&P, they show them happening. Combined with state-of-the-art dissection and physiology lab simulations and a vast question bank for quizzes, homework assignments, and exams, Digital Suite meets students where they are and gives them the tools to master the content. It's the perfect supplement to an OER textbook or just on its own. If you're an A&P instructor, contact your McGraw-Hill representative today and ask about Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite. If you're a student, tell your instructor about it. There's a link to Digital Suite in the show notes of this episode. Get your B or better in A&P with A&P Digital Suite. Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. Today's episode is in response to a request I received from a listener. Mykenzie is a student at Minnesota State University in the United States and has been listening for years. Mykenzie noticed that I skipped over the skeletal system, and that's because it's so visual. I figured it wouldn't lend well to an audio podcast, but you know what? Why don't we try it? Mykenzie asked for an episode on joints, and even though I've shifted to specific diseases, why not throw an episode together here and there to fill in some of the gaps? So here you go, a special midweek bonus episode on joints. When we begin talking about the skeletal system, many students immediately think of bones as rigid supports, almost like the steel frame of a building. That image is useful up to a point, but it misses one of the most important realities of human anatomy. Bones are meaningful not only as individual structures, but also as partners in movement. Where two bones meet, there is a joint, which we also call an articulation. A joint does not always have to be highly mobile to count as a joint. Even if two bones are essentially immobile where they meet, that location is still considered an articulation. In other words, a joint is any place where two or more bones come together, whether they permit motion or not. The branch of science that studies joint structure, function, and dysfunction is called arthrology. Closely related to that is kinesiology, the study of musculoskeletal movement. Arthrology asks questions such as how joints are built, what tissues hold them together, and what goes wrong in conditions such as arthritis or a dislocation. Kinesiology focuses more on motion itself, like how muscles pull on bones or how joints guide motion, and how the body produces actions ranging from standing up out of a chair to throwing a baseball or climbing a hill. For students who are majoring in some kind of preclinical health field, both of these fields matter enormously because movement is one of the main ways that structure reveals function. Let's talk about the way joints are named for a minute. Joint names are often built from the names of the bones that meet there. This naming pattern can help you decode unfamiliar terms. For example, the temporomandibular joint is where the temporal bone of the skull forms an articulation with the mandible of the jaw. The sternoclavicular joint is where the sternum, or breastbone, meets the clavicle, or collarbone. The tibiofemoral joint is where the tibia meets the femur. Once you recognize the roots, the name itself becomes a map. It tells you what structures are interacting and often hints at what kinds of motion or dysfunction might occur there. Now, unfortunately, there is no standard to the naming regimen. So it's not necessarily that in a limb, the proximal bone is named first, or the distal bone is named first. For example, we have tibiofemoral joint. The tibia, the distal bone, is named first in this joint, this at the knee. However, in the shoulder, we have the glenohumeral joint, the glenoid cavity of the scapula and the head of the humerus. In that case, the proximal bone is named first. So There is no rule that is going to tell you which direction the naming takes place. So unfortunately, you just kind of have to remember. Now, joints can be classified in several ways, and anatomists don't always organize them in exactly the same scheme. There's not complete uniformity across everyone, but one common and very useful approach classifies joints according to the material or structural relationship that binds the adjacent bones together. In that framework, joints fall into four broad categories: bony joints, fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Now, these categories are not arbitrary. They correspond to real differences in how the bones are connected and, in general, to real differences in their mobility. As a rule, the more directly bones are fused together, the less movement is possible. The more elaborate the joint cavity between the bones and the supporting structures surrounding them, the greater the potential for motion. To appreciate the most mobile joints in the body, we first need to understand the less mobile ones. So we're going to start with bony joints. A bony joint, also called a synostosis, is an immobile joint that forms when the space between two bones ossifies and the two bones become, functionally, one bone. This is not always how the skeleton begins. Many bony joints arise from joints that were once fibrous or cartilaginous. During development and maturation, the intervening tissue gradually ossifies or turns to bone until the former boundary effectively disappears. The result is a union that no longer permits any movement. This process occurs in a number of familiar places in the body. Early in life, some bones exist as separate right and left halves that later fuse together. In infancy, for example, portions of the frontal bone of the skull and the mandible of the jaw begin as separate elements and later become single, unified bones. During childhood and adolescence, the three parts of the hip bone, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, are distinct and then gradually fuse into one adult coxal bone or hip bone, as it's called. A particularly important developmental example involves the long bones. In children who are still growing, the epiphysis and diaphysis are separated by a plate of cartilage called the epiphyseal plate. So remember that the epiphysis is the extreme ends of a long bone. Many bones, like the femur, have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. The way bones grow is the diaphysis gets longer on both ends. And that happens because there's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. And that's what the epiphyseal growth plate is. When that kid is still growing, this is a cartilaginous joint. It's two bones held together by cartilage. But when they stop growing in their late teens or so, that epiphyseal plate turns to bone, fusing the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And that leaves behind the epiphyseal line. So what was once a cartilage-based union becomes a bony union. Synostoses can also occur later in life. With aging, some bones that were once separate may fuse. In some older adults, the first rib may fuse to the sternum. In others, the two parietal bones may fuse along the sagittal suture in the skull. These examples remind us that the skeleton is dynamic across our lifespan. It's not a fixed arrangement from birth till we're gone. Bones and joints change in structure as growth proceeds, as maturity is reached, and as aging alters tissue properties. The next category is fibrous joints. A fibrous joint is often described as a synarthrosis, meaning a joint with little or no movement. In these joints, adjacent bones are connected by collagen fibers. Those fibers extend from one bone, cross the gap, and anchor into the next bone. There is no joint cavity like the one seen in the shoulder or knee. Those are synovial joints. Instead, the bones are tied together by dense connective tissue. There are three subcategories to fibrous joints. They are sutures, gomphoses, and syndesmoses. Within the category of fibrous joint, there are three subtypes of fibrous joints. They are sutures, gomphoses, and syndesmoses. Sutures and gomphoses allow virtually no movement. But syndesmoses can permit somewhat greater mobility because the fibers are longer and the bones are not bound together as tightly as the others. So let's talk about them individually. Sutures are the fibrous joints of the skull. They occur nowhere else. In a suture, the bones of the cranium are closely united by short collagen fibers. These joints are designed primarily for stability and protection, not movement. The brain needs a strong, bony case around it for protection, and sutures provide that while still allowing developmental changes in skull shape and growth during childhood. Sutures can be further categorized by the shape of the adjoining bone margins, and these shapes are worth knowing because they help explain how the bones interlock with one another. One type is the serrate suture, S-E-R-R-A-T-E. In a serrate suture, the edges of the bones interdigitate with one another in a jagged or sawtooth pattern. Imagine the way two puzzle pieces lock together, or the teeth of a zipper line up. This interlocking geometry resists separation. The coronal, sagittal, and lambdoid sutures of the skull are classic examples. These sutures border the parietal bones and help form the durable shell of the cranium. Their irregular margins make them especially strong under stress. Another type is the lap suture, also called a squamous suture. In this kind of joint, two bones overlap along beveled edges. Rather than interlocking like jagged teeth, they resemble two thin boards laid over each other at the edge. The squamous suture, involving the temporal bone and the adjacent cranial bones, is the classic example. On the surface, such a suture often appears smoother than a serrate one. The overlap helps distribute force and contributes to skull strength without using the same tooth-like structure. The third type is the plain or butt suture. Here, the adjoining bone edges are relatively straight and meet edge to edge without overlap. They simply abut each other. An example is found in the intermaxillary region of the hard palate. This is in the roof of your mouth. Although this arrangement may sound less secure than others, it still forms a firm fibrous union because the collagenous connective tissue binds the neighboring bones together tightly. The other fibrous joint is a gomphosis, though in this case the articulation is not between two bones in the ordinary sense. This is the rule breaker. We say that by definition a joint is when two or more bones are joined together. This is the exception to that rule, because a gomphosis is the joint between a tooth and its socket in the mandible or maxilla. Now, contrary to some beliefs, teeth are not bones. However, this attachment is still classified as a joint because it is an anatomical union between skeletal structures. The term evokes the image of a peg driven into a hole, and that is a useful comparison. The root of the tooth sits in an alveolus or socket of the maxilla or mandible. Between the tooth and the socket is the periodontal ligament made of collagen fibers that anchor the tooth in place. That periodontal ligament is not perfectly rigid, but it is firm. That slight flexibility is physiologically important because when you bite into something like a crisp apple or a crusty piece of bread, the tooth gives just enough to stimulate sensory receptors in the ligament. Those receptors help the nervous system judge bite force. They also make you aware when something is caught between your teeth. Without that tiny mobility and the nerve endings associated with it, biting would be a much cruder and less controlled action. So even a very stable joint can still contribute meaningfully to sensory feedback and functional precision. The third fibrous joint is the syndesmosis. In a syndesmosis, two bones are linked by relatively long collagen fibers, often organized into a ligament or an interosseous membrane. You see this between the ulna and the radius, or the tibia and fibula. Because the fibers are longer than those in sutures or gomphoses, and the bones are not pressed as tightly together, a syndesmosis permits more motion. Not a great deal of motion, but enough to matter functionally. Let's talk about that example between the radius and ulna. This fibrous sheath between them, called the interosseous membrane, binds the diaphyses of the forearm bones together while still allowing pronation and supination, which means the movement like you are emptying a can by turning your palms downward for pronation and upward for supination. The interosseous membrane between the radius and ulna allows that motion to take place. If the radius and ulna were fused rigidly, rotating the palm upward and downward would be impossible. The syndesmosis allows the radius to move in a coordinated way relative to the ulna while preserving forearm integrity. The other example I gave before was between the distal tibia and fibula. That union is less mobile than the one in the forearm, but its slight flexibility is still important for normal ankle mechanics. High ankle sprains often involve injury to this syndesmotic region, and those injuries can be especially troublesome because they destabilize the relationship between the tibia and fibula. If you are a sports fan or an athlete and you've heard about high ankle sprains, you know that there's a fairly long recovery for those. And that's the reason. It's a much more complicated injury than a sprain of the deltoid ligaments or the ligaments on the lateral side of the ankle between the fibula and the tarsals. The next major category is the cartilaginous joint, also called an amphiarthrosis. In these joints, bones are united by cartilage. Compared with fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints often permit a little more movement, though still much less than the typical synovial joints that we're usually thinking of when we think of joints. There are two types of cartilaginous joint: synchondroses and symphyses. A synchondrosis is a joint in which bones are joined by hyaline cartilage. One classic example is already mentioned before. It's the epiphyseal plate of a growing long bone. The cartilage plate links epiphysis to diaphysis and allows longitudinal bone growth. Another example is the union between the first rib and the sternum. Hyaline cartilage forms the bridge between the two. Remember that hyaline cartilage is smooth and somewhat resilient, making it a useful material when a strong but slightly yielding union is needed. Some synchondroses are temporary, as in the growth plate, but others persist longer in life. A symphysis differs in that bones are joined by fibrocartilage rather than hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage is tougher and better suited to resisting compression and tension. The pubic symphysis is a very familiar example. There, the right and left pubic bones are united by an interpubic disc made of fibrocartilage. Another major example is the joint between vertebral bodies. Between adjacent vertebrae sits an intervertebral disc. This is a fibrocartilaginous pad that binds the vertebrae together while allowing slight movement and shock absorption. Each individual intervertebral joint allows a small amount of motion, but when you add up the contributions of all the discs along the entire vertebral column, the spine as a whole becomes remarkably flexible. This is an important concept in anatomy and physiology. Small motions at many levels can combine into substantial total motion. When you bend forward to tie a shoe, when you rotate to look over your shoulder while driving, or you lean sideways to reach something on a shelf, You're not relying on one highly mobile joint in the trunk of your body. You're benefiting from the cumulative effect of many slightly mobile intervertebral symphyses and associated facet joints working together. The facet joints are the more movable synovial joints in the posterior part of the vertebrae.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify. Shopify is the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts go abandoned and way more sales going through. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period for 3 months at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
Okay, that brings us to the most familiar and functionally dramatic category of all, synovial joints. Synovial joints are also called diarthroses, and they're the joints that most people think of when they're asked to identify a joint. Shoulder, knees, ankles, wrists, elbows. These are all examples of synovial joints. Many synovial joints are freely movable, but they're not all equally mobile. Some joints are more movable than others. For example, the joints between the carpal bones of your wrist, or between the vertebral articular processes. Those are also synovial joints, even though each individual one only permits a small amount of motion. What unites synovial joints is not the amount of movement, it's their structural plan. Synovial joints are also the most structurally complex joints and among the most clinically important. These are the joints most likely to be injured in athletics, overused in repetitive work, inflamed in arthritis, or surgically repaired in orthopedic practice. Their condition strongly influences independence, mobility, and quality of life. A healthy synovial joint allows an older adult to rise from bed. It allows a violinist to control finger motion, a mechanic to turn tools, and a soccer player to sprint and pivot. When a synovial joint fails because of degeneration, inflammation, or trauma, everyday tasks can become difficult or even impossible. To understand synovial joints, we'll begin with the surfaces of the bones. The ends of the articulating bones are capped by articular cartilage, which is a layer of hyaline cartilage, usually a few millimeters thick. This cartilage covers the bone surfaces that face each other. It provides a smooth, resilient surface that reduces friction and helps absorb compressive forces. Importantly, the articular cartilage does not contain blood vessels of its own. That makes nutrition and waste removal dependent on the environment of the joint itself. Between the articular surfaces is a narrow space called the joint cavity or articular cavity. Sometimes you'll hear synovial cavity. This space contains synovial fluid, the slippery lubricant that gives the synovial joint its name. Synovial fluid has a viscous texture due in part to substances such as hyaluronic acid, and it is often compared in consistency to an uncooked egg white. This fluid plays several essential roles. It lubricates the joint so that the movement can occur with minimal friction. It nourishes the articular cartilage. It also helps remove metabolic waste from that cartilage. Because articular cartilage lacks its own direct blood supply, the health of the cartilage depends heavily on the quality and circulation of synovial fluid. Movement actually helps with this process because compression and release of the cartilage during normal activity promotes fluid exchange. Enclosing the joint cavity is the articular or synovial capsule. Sometimes you'll hear people just say joint capsule. This capsule is made of connective tissue and has two distinct layers. The outer layer is the fibrous capsule, which is continuous with the periosteum of the adjoining bones. This outer layer provides strength and support. And inside that is the synovial membrane, a softer cellular layer that lines the capsule. In fact, the synovial membrane is the part that contains the cells that secrete synovial fluid, and it also contains macrophages that help clear debris from the joint cavity. So the capsule is not just a passive wrapping, it is both a stabilizing structure and an active biological participant in maintaining the joint's environment. Joint capsules and ligaments are also rich in sensory receptors. These include nerve endings that monitor stretch, pressure, and joint position. This sensory input contributes to proprioception, the brain's awareness of our body's position and movement. When you close your eyes, you still know whether or not your elbow is flexed. You know whether your knee is bent, or whether your fingers are spread apart or you're making a fist. You're relying heavily on receptors in and around those joints. This is one reason joint injury can disrupt not only movement, but also coordination. Some synovial joints contain fibrocartilaginous pads that improve joint mechanics. In certain joints, this fibrocartilage forms an articular disc that extends all the way across the joint cavity. Examples are the temporomandibular joint, or TMJ, that's your jaw joint, the sternoclavicular joint, where your sternum and clavicle meet, the acromioclavicular joint, which is where the clavicle meets the acromion of your scapula, and the joint between the ulna and the carpal bones. In the knee, the fibrocartilage pads are incomplete crescents called menisci. These structures are famous in sports medicine because meniscal tears are common in knee injuries. Whether we call it a disc or a meniscus, fibrocartilage in a synovial joint serves several functions. It helps absorb shock, distributes pressure, improves the fit between mismatched bone surfaces, guides motion, and helps stabilize the joint. Consider the knee. The femoral condyles, those the distal part of the femur, and the tibial plateau do not match perfectly in shape. And the menisci help compensate for that mismatch. They deepen the surface, they improve congruence, and they reduce stress concentration. Without them, weight-bearing forces would be distributed less effectively. Synovial joints are also supported by accessory structures, especially tendons, ligaments, and bursae. A tendon attaches muscle to bone. A ligament attaches bone to bone. Both are made primarily of dense, collagenous connective tissue, but they serve different roles. Tendons transmit the pull of muscles, creating movement, whereas ligaments help stabilize joints and guide or limit motion. In many joints, tendons are especially important for stability. The shoulder is an excellent example. Its bony socket is relatively shallow, so muscular tendons crossing the joint provide much of its functional stability. We call those muscles the rotator cuff. A bursa is a small fibrous sac lined like a synovial membrane and containing a thin film of synovial fluid. Bursae occur where tissues rub against each other, such as where a tendon passes over a bone, where skin moves over a bony prominence, or where adjacent muscles slide. Their job is to reduce friction. Think about the repeated motion of kneeling, lifting, or reaching overhead. Without bursae, soft tissues would grind more directly against underlying structures. Inflammation of a bursa, called bursitis, can make even ordinary movements really painful. A specialized form of bursa is the tendon sheath, an elongated tubular bursa wrapped around a tendon. Tendon sheaths are especially common in the wrist, hand, ankle, and foot, where tendons pass through confined spaces and need to glide more efficiently against each other. When you type, play piano, grip a tennis racket, or walk long distances, these tendon sheaths help reduce friction around tendons that are moving constantly. Another name for the tendon sheath is the tenosynovium. When they get inflamed, which is called tenosynovitis, they tend to trap the tendons inside the sheath. And sometimes, especially in the hand, you get like a trigger finger where the finger gets stuck in a position. That's because the tendon is trapped in that sheath. Okay, let's connect joints to an important mechanical concept, the lever. Many bones, especially long bones, function as levers. A lever is any rigid object that rotates around a fixed point, which we call a fulcrum. Think of a seesaw. In the body, the fulcrum is usually a joint. A muscle provides the effort, and the resistance is the load being moved. That load may be an external object, like you're holding a coffee mug filled with coffee, or the weight of a body part, like just the weight of your hand itself, or the force generated by another muscle trying to oppose that joint's movement. To analyze a lever, we have to consider two distances. One is the effort arm. The effort arm is the distance from the fulcrum to the point where effort is applied. The resistance arm is the other one. That is the distance from the fulcrum to the point where the resistance is. These distances matter because they influence mechanical advantage, which we abbreviate MA. Mechanical advantage is the ratio of effort arm length to resistance arm length. If the effort arm is longer than the resistance arm, the lever has a mechanical advantage greater than 1 and favors force production. If the effort arm is shorter than the resistance arm, the mechanical advantage is less than 1 and the lever favors speed and distance of movement rather than force. Think about someone sitting on a seesaw. You'll have an easier time lifting them in the air if you push down on your end further from the fulcrum. The closer you get to the fulcrum, the harder you have to push. That's because you are shortening the effort arm. And, having said that, the further from the fulcrum that person is sitting makes them heavier, relatively speaking. The human musculoskeletal system often sacrifices force advantage to gain speed and range. Consider elbow flexion, when you bend your elbow. If a muscle such as the brachialis inserts close to the elbow joint, then the effort arm is short. The hand and any other object that's in it are further from the joint, so the resistance arm is long. This produces a mechanical advantage less than 1. At first, students sometimes assume that is a poor design, but it's actually excellent for rapid and extensive movement of the hand. A small shortening of the muscle can create a much larger and faster movement at the hand. That's useful when you're feeding yourself, when you're writing, you're lifting objects, or you have to react to something quickly. Different muscles acting on the same joint may have different insertion points and therefore different mechanical advantages. This is why what seems like redundancy in muscular anatomy is often functionally meaningful. One muscle may be better suited for initiating movement against a heavy resistance, while another may be better for fast movement once inertia has been overcome. Think of getting a heavy sled moving across grass versus sprinting once already in motion. The body, like a machine with gear options, can favor force in one circumstance and speed in the other. Levers are classified into 3 classes, depending on which component lies in the middle: the fulcrum, the resistance, or the effort. In a first-class lever, the fulcrum is in the middle. A classic non-anatomical example is the seesaw I mentioned. In the body, one example is the atlanto-occipital arrangement involved in balancing the head. This is where the atlas meets the occipital bone. The joint acts as a fulcrum, the posterior neck muscles supply the effort, and the weight of the head and the anterior skull acts as the resistance. Another example occurs when the foot rocks on the distal tibia as the toes are raised and lowered under certain conditions. In a second-class lever, the resistance is in the middle. A wheelbarrow is the classic example. The fulcrum is the wheel, the resistance is the bucket and its contents, and the effort is the handles you pull up on. The resistance ends up being between the wheel and the handles. In other words, between the fulcrum and the effort. In the body, one can see a second-class arrangement in some lower limb actions, such as when body weight is lifted under certain conditions during plantar flexion. That's when you are pointing your toes or standing on your toes. Another illustrative example is raising the thigh when seated while the load lies between the hip joint and the point where muscular effort is effectively transmitted. In a third-class lever, the effort lies between the fulcrum and the resistance. This is by far the most common arrangement in the human body. Elbow flexion with the biceps and brachialis is a standard example. The elbow is the fulcrum. Muscle force is applied to the forearm close to the joint, but distal to it, and the resistance is in the hand or the forearm's own weight. So the resistance and the effort are on the same side as the fulcrum, with the effort in the middle. Third-class levers are poor at multiplying force, but they are excellent at generating speed and distance, which suits the mobile, versatile actions that human performance requires. One fascinating point is that a body part can function as different classes of levers depending on the movement they're doing. The forearm can behave as a third-class lever during flexion and as a first-class lever during extension in certain activities. The mandible also changes functional lever class depending on whether the mouth is opening or closing and where the bite force is being applied. This reminds us that anatomy is not just about static structures. Functional relationships shift depending on posture, movement, and the load that we're trying to move. Another major concept in joint function is range of motion. Range of motion refers to the degrees through which a joint can move. It is a practical and clinically important measure of flexibility and function. The knee has a large flexion range. The ankle has a more limited but still vital range. Finger joints, shoulder joints, and hip joints all have characteristic normal ranges. Range of motion matters because it affects independence and human performance. A reduced shoulder range of motion may make it harder to comb your hair or grab half a gallon of milk off the refrigerator shelf. Reduced hip range of motion may impair walking or the ability to get up out of a chair. And reduced spinal range of motion could make it difficult to dress yourself, to drive, or even sleep. Several factors determine range of motion. One is the shape of the articular surfaces. Sometimes bone geometry simply blocks further movement. You can't normally extend the elbow far beyond straight because the olecranon of the ulna fits into the olecranon fossa of the humerus and acts as a bony stopgap. Likewise, the contour of various joint regions guides motion and limits extremes. A second factor is the strength and tautness of the ligaments and the joint capsule. In some joints, the bones alone would allow more movement than the living body permits, but ligaments tighten as motion approaches the limit, preventing excessive excursion. In the fingers, for example, the arrangement of ligaments keeps the joints from bending indefinitely. In the knee, major ligaments, including cruciate ligaments inside the knee joint, help prevent excessive extension and abnormal translation. In individuals who are very flexible, such as gymnasts or dancers, part of the increased range of motion comes from gradual stretching of soft tissues around the joints. You've probably heard of the term double jointed. These people do not actually have extra joints. What they have is unusually lax ligaments or other connective tissue properties that permit more motion. A third factor is muscle and tendon action. Muscles don't merely move joints, they also restrain and stabilize them. In fact, muscles are a stronger stabilizer of joints than ligaments are. Opposing muscle groups act like dynamic brakes, controlling speed and range. We call those muscles antagonists. Even at rest, muscles maintain a low level of contraction called muscle tone. This tone stabilizes many joints. The shoulder is again a useful example. Because the glenoid cavity is shallow, the humeral head relies heavily on muscular tension, especially from muscles of the tendons crossing the joint that I told you earlier were the rotator cuff. The nervous system continually monitors joint position and adjusts muscle tone in response. Stability, therefore, is both structural and neuromuscular. To describe joint motion precisely, anatomists also consider axes of rotation. In geometry, we speak of three perpendicular axes, commonly labeled x, y, and z. In anatomy, we think instead in relation to the transverse, frontal, and sagittal planes. I talked about those way back in the early episodes. A bone moving in one plane rotates around an axis perpendicular to that plane. Let me give you some examples. If you raise your arm out to the side, the movement occurs in the frontal plane, and the axis of rotation runs approximately from front to back, which corresponds to the sagittal axis. If you raise your arm straight in front of you, the motion occurs in the sagittal plane around a frontal axis. If you swing your arm horizontally across your body, the motion occurs in the transverse plane around a vertical axis. Joints differ in how many planes they can move through. A multi-axial joint moves in 3 planes and has 3 degrees of freedom. There are only 2 examples of multi-axial joints: the ball and socket joint of the shoulder, the glenohumeral joint, and the femoroacetabular joint, that's the ball and socket of your hip. Biaxial joints move in 2 planes, and monaxial joints move primarily in 1 plane. Degrees of freedom are a central feature of synovial joint classification. And there are 6 traditional classes of synovial joints, based on articular surface shape and permitted movement. The most mobile and the only multi-axial type is the ball and socket joint. And again, we have 2 of those. One in the shoulder, one in the hip, and they're both bilateral. So 4 total, but 2 different ones. In these joints, a rounded head fits into a cup-like socket. The shoulder gains extraordinary mobility from this arrangement, though at some expense to stability. The hip has the same general type, but a deeper socket and more robust surrounding structures, so it trades a little mobility for greater stability. Condylar or ellipsoid joints are biaxial. They have an oval convex surface fitting into an oval depression. Examples include the wrist joint and the metacarpophalangeal joints at the base of the fingers. These joints permit flexion and extension, as well as abduction and adduction, which we'll talk about later. You use such motions when closing the hand around a coffee mug and then spreading the fingers to release it. Saddle joints are also biaxial, but each articulating surface is concave in one direction and convex in the other, like a rider's saddle on a horse. The most famous saddle joint is the trapeziometacarpal joint at the base of the thumb. This joint gives the thumb a remarkable range of motion and contributes critically to the movement called opposition, one of the defining features of human manual dexterity. Opposition is when you bring your thumb across the palm of your hand and touch the tip of your pinky. You might have heard the term opposable thumbs. Another saddle joint is the sternoclavicular joint, and that allows the clavicle to move in ways essential for shoulder girdle motion, such as when lifting a backpack or pushing open a heavy gate. Plane joints, also called gliding joints, have relatively flat surfaces. Their movements are limited and often involve sliding. Examples are found among the carpal bones, tarsal bones, and the vertebral articular processes. Each individual joint glides only a little, but collectively these joints allow substantial and finely tuned movements. The wrist, for instance, depends not only on its major radiocarpal joint, but also on the coordinated gliding of many small carpal articulations. Hinge joints are mostly monaxial and allow motion primarily in one plane, like a door hinge. The elbow, the interphalangeal joints of your digits, and much of the knee's motion fit the description of a hinge joint. The articular surfaces are shaped to favor flexion and extension, while restricting most other movement. Now, that said, the knee is not a pure hinge joint in every respect. It also has a slight rotational component under some conditions, which helps explain why real anatomy often resists perfect categorization. And the last one is the pivot joint. Pivot joints are monaxial joints in which one bone rotates around another or around a ligamentous ring. The atlantoaxial joint between the atlas and the axis allows the head to rotate left and right around the dens of the axis, like you're shaking your head no. The proximal radio-ulnar joint allows the radius to rotate during pronation and supination. That's flipping your palm down and up. These are elegant joints for rotational motion, like a wheel turning around an axle.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify. Shopify is the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts go abandoned and way more sales going through. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period for 3 months at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
As useful as these categories are, some joints just don't fit neatly into one box. The temporomandibular joint has condylar, has hinge-like, and has gliding-like features. When you open and close your mouth, part of the motion resembles a hinge. When the jaw protrudes or moves side to side during chewing, gliding becomes the important motion. The knee also behaves mainly as a hinge joint, but like I said before, it also includes subtle rotational features, especially when the knee is locking and unlocking. And the joint between the distal humerus and the proximal radius, the humeroradial joint, contributes to both hinge action and the rotation that we get in supination and pronation. These examples are good reminders that living joints are often more versatile than what textbook categories suggest. Okay, so there you have the general description of what a joint or articulation is, the main classes of joints, the subtypes of those classes, and the concept of levers and how they apply to joints. Not to mention, I also threw range of motion in there, and that's going to be helpful moving forward as well. That's probably enough for one episode, but it's not everything that needs to go with joints. So in the next episode, Joints Part 2, I'll get deeper into synovial joints, the most clinically significant class of arthrology, and I'll discuss the angular movements that take place at those synovial joints. I'll run down a list of the most clinically significant joints and the common injuries that take place at those joints. Once again, a big thank you to Mykenzie in Minnesota for suggesting these episodes. I hope this show is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Good luck, be well, and I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media and is hosted by the Believe Network. Please take the time to rate my show and leave a review. You can also check out the content I post on Instagram and YouTube as @StudentHelp4AP. That's the number 4 AP. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where your instructor can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology currently being used at several colleges and universities. If your instructor isn't using Digital Suite, let them know about it. The link is in the show notes.
The sun's shining, birds are singing, and all feels right in the world.
Until the season changes and suddenly you lose your motivation to get out of bed. In fact, 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the season or time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all, because we want you to live your best life and be your best you all year round.
Please visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.